Cool. So we can get started. Sorry about the bit of a wait. I generally like to keep a bit of time before we start off a webinar because people generally take about 5-7 minutes to get on. Just to start off, uh, oh, interesting. I didn't know that the option to change your name was not available in this one. Sorry about that. Uh, yeah, well, it's not really so much a presentation call. You're welcome to jump in and ask questions. In case you want to view an audio, we've got the webinar host here who'll probably, if you raise your hand, they'll be able to give you a chance to jump in and ask questions. Or you can always put it in the chat and we can take it from there. So just to start off, I'd like to get a sense, a couple of points of order. We are recording the session, so if you don't want your voice on record, just use the chat. If you'd like to be on it, definitely get on and ask. Glad to see there's a fair number of people from a fair variety of regions here. Before we start off, can I get a quick sense from everyone? What's the sort of expectation from this call? What are you looking to? Why is privacy of interest? And why did you sort of choose to be here for an hour today? If I can just get a quick one-liners inputs. I think somebody's got their hand up. Great, I've got Drona here. Yeah, if you want to just put it in your few people with their hands up. So anyone want to kick off and just put a few thoughts in there in the chat? What are you looking to get from this conversation? Yeah, Ashraf, I see your hand up. Can you put it in the chat? I guess it's still on mute. I don't have the audio controls here. What is VPN? Looking to sharpen skills as a practitioner. Great. Any other questions? Any thoughts? Any reasons why you're here? Anything you'd like to put out there? Broad questions. I'm starting to see a few in the chat. Pratik, could you possibly unmute Ashraf? I think she's got her hand up, or you can just put it in the chat, Ashraf. That would work.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry. I was just figuring it out. Thanks so much for bringing me here, Arjun. I'm a real amateur, so I'm here to really learn. We are working on data, particularly in relation to trying to create youth organizations to be in charge and owners of their own data in the long term. So this is just 100% learning from scratch for me. So I'll be more quiet now. Thanks.
Okay. So protecting data when you're working with communities is the broad question, I guess. There, I've got a few in the chat. How do I know what problems I may have had without VPN so far? Great, excellent question. How to protect your privacy online? A guide for the layman, non-techies. Okay, great. We'll talk a little bit about that. Great. So this is a good place to start. I guess how to protect your privacy online. Good question to ask initially is why is privacy relevant? We are now, particularly with the corona scare that's kind of going around. A lot of us are sort of quarantined or self-isolated at home, and we're practicing social distancing. And right now is when the online world is sort of looking like it's never been this important before. We're having this call as probably many of us are having other calls of a similar nature. With our co-workers because everybody's working from home now, and so as we move towards a more online time in our lives, it's kind of important to think about how does our online behavior, how does it expose us, and what are the implications of that exposure. So I've had a lot of people come and tell me, hey, I don't really need privacy. I don't need to hide anything. Whatever I'm doing is kind of open. And then, the moment you ask them, okay, in that case, can I have your bank details, and can I go in and look at your bank statement? A lot of people at that point sort of take a step back and say, hey, no, didn't talk about that kind of stuff. And then there's certain politicians who kind of made that claim that, hey, you can even take a look at my bank details. And then then you can ask further a little bit more probing questions. Can I then also look at your internet traffic and see what kind of sites you visit? And then they might take a few steps back and say, hey, I don't really want my online habits to be publicly available and visible to everybody. So depending on the context, privacy can mean different things for different people. I think just to set context, what we're doing here in this webinar, this is essentially in response to a few queries that I've been receiving directly. And the idea here was to kind of have a basic chat around why privacy is relevant and how to protect yourself online as a broad primer for people who may not be very technical in their work. And then, of course, if there are follow-on questions, everybody on this chat room essentially knows how to reach me. So you're welcome to reach out and ask follow-on questions directly, or if you're comfortable asking them as FAQs, which everybody else can see, your questions can then help add to other people's knowledge. So I'd encourage everyone to put it in the chat as far as possible, because that way we have a written set of questions, and that's kind of easier to track. If you're not comfortable putting stuff on the chat and you'd rather speak, then please raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can contribute to the conversation. But note that then obviously somebody has to go back and read through the video or watch through the video and get that question out there to put in the FAQ section. So it would be great if people could just use the chat. But of course, if you'd like to speak instead, feel free to do so. The raise hand has just gotten tested out. And we've got a great web host moderator here who can help us with that. I'm not identifying you, webinar host. I'm not sure if you're comfortable with that, but if you'd like to be named, feel free. Great. So I guess in terms of the questions that we have, if I visit sites via incognito tab, am I safe? That's the latest one. And that's an interesting question. So quick show of hands, how many people are of the opinion that if you're using something from your incognito mode in your browser, that prevents everyone else from being able to see what you've been up to? Really quick one, like anybody who thinks that that's the case, just put up their hand and say why or hi or something. Anyone who's living with that belief that incognito mode is sufficient? All right, great. We've got one person who says they're comfortable with it. I got a show of hand. Let's see who's got their hand up. All right, so one person says that. All right, okay, great. Akash says no, it's not. I use it not to be seen in my history. Okay, great. So here's an interesting point about incognito mode. So incognito mode, essentially, all it does is that it creates a little sandbox inside your computer, and whatever activity you do doesn't get copied over to all the other places that it normally would, like your recent sites visited or your history or your temporary internet folder or things like that. And when you close that session, ostensibly no trace of it remains on your computer. A couple of myths about incognito mode. It does not prevent your ISP, which is your internet service provider, from seeing what you're visiting or where you're going. So anybody who has access to your connection and who can see what sites are being visited, and we'll come back to this in a minute, can essentially take a look at your internet traffic and still know what you're visiting, and they'll know somebody on that network is visiting it. And depending on, if you go in and sign into your Gmail on an incognito mode, you might be exposing your credentials, all kinds of risks there. The only thing that incognito mode does very effectively is that potentially it prevents other people who use the same computer from running into each other's history. So that bit it does somewhat okay, but there as well, any files that you download under your incognito mode, would essentially still remain on the computer. So, if you went and downloaded, say, a game and you didn't want your folks to find out, and I'm being safe here, that executable might still end up being on that computer later, and somebody would know if somebody downloaded it. That's not going anywhere. So anything you download explicitly, definitely, it comes out of the sandbox. It stays on your hard disk even after you close the incognito mode. This does not apply to images that you might visit while you're browsing. That kind of stuff generally goes into what's called the temporary internet folder. So a sandbox is essentially a little piece of your hard drive that's not accessible to other parts of the operating system. So not everything can look inside it. Not everything can access things inside it. And so things stay contained. It's just a little part of your hard drive that's blocked off from everybody else's access. So that's a bit about incognito mode. Getting back to privacy concerns. So where incognito mode can help is, say, if you're using a public computer, if you need to, say, access your email from the airport, for example. It's a fairly innocuous piece of work to do. So there you might want to use incognito mode, because what you're then doing is that anybody else who comes onto the computer doesn't have access to your information. But and you don't really necessarily have a problem with the airport internet service provider looking at you accessing your email, because generally there's a second layer of encryption between you and your email provider. So it's not like they can read your email. All they'll know is that you accessed your Gmail inbox, which might not be of concern to you. So in that kind of a scenario, using incognito mode works well. If you're in a South Asian country like India, where you still have cyber cafes, I mean, though that's now almost a dying trend with the mobile scenario, you might want to use incognito mode, and that's that kind of a scenario as well. Or if you for some reason have to share a computer with someone for whatever reason, there it can kind of help out quite a bit. So that's the bit about incognito mode, and that's the extent to which it can help you out with your privacy requirements. So here's an interesting question. How do I protect myself when my privacy is dependent to a large extent on others who have my data? And simple example, friends who have me on their contact list and are doing things like sharing contact lists with random parties. So this is a very, very real privacy concern, and this is one that kind of falls outside the purview of tools. I'll come back to VPN in a moment, because that has a broader sort of context and application. But I think this is a very, very key point in privacy. Who you engage with and what kind of information you share with people you engage with is something that we all need to start paying a lot more attention to than we do. And I come from what I consider the old days of the internet. Back in the 90s and in the early 2000s, internet was not so easily available. You generally used it from a shared medium. I don't think I got myself a private computer until I was in second, third year of college. So and even then, it didn't have an internet connection. I had to go to a cyber cafe, download whatever I needed, and bring it back home. So there was this almost now it's called air gapping. For us, it was pretty much a standard way of life. But what that did impose was that there was a certain amount of thought that went into accessing the internet. There was a big barrier to entry, and so you paid a lot of attention to what you put out there. Most people in the early days of the internet did not use their real names or their photographs. There was not enough bandwidth to do photographs, but even our real names were not something we would be very comfortable putting out. So I remember my first email address was smartfox007 at I think one of the free site providers at that point in time. But essentially, GeoCities, yeah, it was and so at that point, it made no sense to put your real name out in the public domain, because there was almost nothing which was tied to your identity per se. Online banking hadn't started off yet. None of those things were kind of there. So at that point in time, privacy meant very different things. Now, we're living in a world where our identities, even our biometrics, are tied to things we do online, like making a transaction or even if you open a Facebook or a Twitter account nowadays, they require a phone number, which is technically then tied to your Aadhaar, which is then tied to your biometric. So it's very, very closely tied up. And so what you reveal about yourself to the public needs to be given a lot of thought. In terms of contact sharing, one of the biggest nuisances that I've found to my own privacy is this thing called Truecaller. Truecaller is this, it seems like a great idea that you share your contact list with this centralized provider, and then everybody else can see who actually is calling them. It's been very, very useful for a lot of people to prevent things like spam calls from unwanted numbers, because you can then you do a large amount of spam marking as a community. But it's also had some very interesting adverse effects. So I've had people come and tell me that, hey, I'm a sales guy. It's my job to call people, and now I've been put on a blacklist, and so I have to keep changing my phone numbers. And so that's a very legit sort of a concern. Even if you're not a spam caller, you could get kind of tagged as a spam caller by enough numbers that you kind of get blacklisted and nobody wants to take your call anymore. It's going to happen in error. Now, we've had scenarios where mobile companies have reused phone numbers. I've had my phone number reused by BSNL, no less. And so, there have been times when there have been actually two SIM cards with the same phone number going around. And so, this kind of scenarios, getting onto a public database with a phone number can render you vulnerable in many, many kinds of ways. So, one is people automatically know who you are. So, simple example is a lot of people do this on dating apps. They'll go and look up somebody's name, potentially find that on Truecaller, or you just exchange WhatsApp numbers, and the first thing you do is go and look it up on Truecaller and see who it's registered to. And that kind of stuff which would generally be reserved for an investigative agency is now something that everybody does almost as a matter of default. And there are now services that will offer background checks and things like that, which are generally based on public data. And we've built reference tools that actually go out and collect public data from just things like Facebook and Twitter and so forth. And just kind of harvesting data can reveal so much information about people. So the only real way to answer your question, Tinlik, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. If it's something else, please do let me know. Is to really not share information that is deeply private. So if you want a slightly semi-public interface, you all need to start thinking a bit like celebrities. Celebrities always have this thing of having one number, which is kind of like the board number. When you call and it generally goes to an automated response or an answering machine of some sort. And then there's the actual private number, which is not really revealed to too many people. So I think, those of us who can afford it definitely need to now start thinking in terms of, having additional phone numbers which are private, and you save those for closer people. And that's really the only way to distribute your risk. Examples of data harvesting, greatest example is Cambridge Analytica. They did this phenomenal little experiment where they had BuzzFeed-like quizzes, and the information that people were providing sort of innocuously, what kind of Marvel superhero are you, or what kind of flower are you, or something as vague as that. These were kind of questions that were designed to do kind of a psychological assessment and an attitude assessment on people. And so when that data was kind of put into an analytics system that could find patterns at a vast scale, you could start looking at what kind of influences would help a political party win the election. So it starts out really small. Something as simple as your purchase history on a grocery site reveals that you don't consume any red meat. Your diet is largely vegan. That can be used to then politically target you. And at some level, you might say that from a purely data capitalistic point of view, it's just advertising at the end of the day, and the better you know your consumer, the better you can serve them, and all of those arguments. However, there's an element of what some of us call engineering of consent. Meaning that if somebody knows more about your attitudes and your patterns than you do yourself, their influence over you can be substantial. So data harvesting has kind of, it's a double-edged sword. It does help you solve a few problems really, really well. So right now, like there's a big discussion going on in terms of state surveillance on coronavirus victims. To see how what can we do to track them better so people know if they're in an area which has an infection risk and things like that. And it's a double-edged sword. The more access we offer up right now for protection, the less places to kind of have privacy we'll have once this crisis is over. So it's one of those very very touchy subjects. I mean, it can go either way. So I've seen proposals from Pakistan, I've seen proposals from Israel, and so forth. Very very interesting arguments being given for better state surveillance and so forth. So here's a question: if you don't agree to sharing contacts, I cannot access many apps. For example, Smule. I'm not very familiar with what Smule does exactly. So this is a question really about app permissions. And I'd love to share a link here at this point. It's called the Data Detox Kit. And it's an interesting little set of content that's been put together by Tactical Tech, and Hackergram did a nice little translation of this into Hindi and Bengali. In fact, we'd love to get feedback from some of the people who speak those languages on the quality of the translation. If you'd like to take a look at the content and give us feedback on it, that would be great. But there's also a bunch of other languages available on it. It's available in a bunch of regional languages. But the point is that this is so the point of sharing this is this is almost like a tutorial or an educational program around tracking your own data footprint. And this should answer your question as well. How can you protect yourself better from other people's poor data choices? This is one place to start looking. It will help you kind of assess your data footprint, and then it will also tell you how to minimize that in many ways. So in terms of answering the question around permissions of applications, so when you download an application, you generally do it for the features you like. But one thing that none of us almost look at very carefully is app permissions. So when you're installing an application, it's generally, and particularly under things like GDPR in Europe, there's now a requirement for companies to disclose what kind of permissions they require on your device and what kind of data they're going to collect. And so that's a good place to look and see, what kind of permissions are your applications asking for before installing them. And then, if they're asking for permissions that are kind of elevated, like, for example, access to your contacts or access to your network, you might want to do a little bit more research into, who owns the app, what's the company behind it, what jurisdiction are they based in, and things like that. Because that becomes then the kind of the core thing. That's the person or that's the legal entity that you're sharing your data with. And so that's the legal entity you're giving permission to access your contacts. So if it's, say, you find out that Smule, for example, is run by a company that also does market research and data harvesting for the government of Sudan. Just wild example there. You may not want to share your contact list with that company. But if somebody, if it's a company that's based in a jurisdiction that you're comfortable with, you're confident about their data policies, you may want to then in that case say, okay, hey, I'm okay with this bunch of people accessing my contacts, and you might want to share your contact list with them. And so that's a personal choice that all of us make, but to Timothy's point, your data choices also impact people on your contact list. So my take is always, if you want to also protect people, have a separate set of circle for your associates versus your close ones. Maybe have a separate account, a Google account where you only have your public contacts added, and so you don't really mind sharing around those contacts, and you may not want to share the private contacts of people, so you have a different account to keep those on. But it's definitely something to think about and share and kind of distribute. So the thing with security and privacy is, the more you distribute your risk and your exposure, the less chances you have of being targeted or being tracked or getting into a bad situation. So it's just about cutting your exposure down on a particular channel to as little as possible, and then distribute it across as many as you can. So have multiple accounts, have multiple SIM cards, and have purpose specific stuff. So you have one which is for family and friends, which is the circuit whose data you're committed to protecting, and you don't share that in a public domain. And then you have one which is kind of your public persona, where it's all your professional contacts who may not have a problem. In fact, in some cases, you want to be associated with certain people in public because it kind of adds to your credibility. So you keep those that on a separate account track. And these days, with Google's account policies, you can set up as many as you want. Not concentrating all your data in one place is generally a good way to protect yourself. Coming forward into VPN, so a virtual private network, it's now kind of, over the last couple of years in particular, it's been promoted a lot as a privacy protection tool. But a VPN essentially is simply a part of the internet that you kind of, that is composed of servers that work in collusion with each other. And it provides like a private local network. It provides similar functionality to what you'd get on a local home network, but across the internet. So essentially, it's almost a way. It's an access mechanism. It's not just a privacy protection tool. VPNs have been used by companies for years. I mean, most companies still, if you work for a software company or if you work for an enterprise kind of a corporation, they generally, your work laptop will have a VPN connection to your office network. And that's basically what it means, is that your office has set up a server which your local computer talks to. And it then provides your local computer with access to all the other members of that private network. And so that's really essentially what a VPN really is. I've got a question here. Laws protecting children are not technology neutral. What's the best way to protect children without entirely banning access? Okay, great. So we'll come to that. Just a little bit more about the VPN side of things. So VPN essentially allows you, if you have a VPN with your office, it might allow you to access. Yeah, exactly. It can help you access your documents in the company server. But that's generally in the context of a company. You can also set up a VPN between you and your friends. So say you have a few trusted friends with whom you can, who you trust to share certain information with. You can set up a private VPN. Essentially, all that it really requires is go to Amazon Web Services, set up yourself a private account, and you can actually set up your own servers and do that. Interesting question, which is the best VPN to use in India? A lot of them ask to install extensions. So this is a very, very subjective question. I'm going to actually share an interesting comparison that's on Wikipedia with regard to VPNs. Essentially, what you want to think about when you're using a VPN, firstly, there are paid VPN services and there are free VPN services. So paid VPN services are generally a few people who set up some private servers, and they're willing to provide anonymity and privacy as a service, which means you pay them a certain amount of money every month in order for you to connect to their servers. And then they'll basically mask your traffic from your internet service provider, your government, your friends, family, plus anybody else who's on the network, and provide it safe passage. So that's generally what a paid VPN is doing. A free VPN does exactly the same thing, except they claim to do it for free. But yes, VPN can be set up across countries. VPN is pretty much, it's a global network. You can set it up anywhere on the internet. I can set up a private server and provide access to somebody living in the US, and then when they connect to that server, my server can then provide them information about all the other members of the network, the trusted members, who they can then communicate with using the same protocol. So there are many kinds of networks that kind of exist in terms of VPNs. And your access would generally depend on, if it's a paid VPN, on whether you paid your subscription fees. And so if I gave you access to my VPN and you didn't pay the fees, your access key would expire and you wouldn't be able to get on anymore. In terms of what's the best VPN to use in India, again, it's a subjective term. It really depends on what your requirement is. So the couple of risks with using VPNs is your VPN provider definitely knows what you're doing on the network. they have access to your traffic. So they're receiving the traffic on one of their servers, and then they're rerouting it to whoever you ask to be rerouted to. And that could be within the private network, or it could be outside the private network. So somebody from the private network fetches that resource for you from the external address and then sends it back to you. So that's called a proxying function. So a proxy is basically, you like your attendance proxies in college. It's exactly the same principle. You're asking somebody else to do something for you because you can't do it yourself because for whatever reason you're not there. You don't want to be seen doing it. Whatever reason, yeah. So just the way you would ask your friend to give your attendance in your place, it's the same way. Supposing you want to access a web page that's banned in your country, or you want to access a service that is hidden inside a VPN, you'd go to a different server that has access to it and say, hey, can you fetch that for me and send it across back to me? And so that's really what the proxy function is. And a VPN is not generally limited to proxy functions. It also provides that as an additional feature. So most VPNs are generally enterprise VPNs that allow people to get access to their company's internal resources. But now VPNs are also gaining popularity as a privacy mechanism. So in terms of whether it's data safe, again, depends on who owns the VPN, who owns the servers, where are they located, what jurisdiction do they live in. So for example, I use what's called Air VPN, and it's one of the lesser known, lesser talked about VPN services out there. And it's a privacy centric VPN. So it does not let me do Netflix or Amazon Prime from a different country by posing to be from a different country. But on the flip side, it would work in China. It also has, it supports mechanisms that allow me to mask the fact that I'm using a VPN altogether, which is like things like OpenVPN over SSL, which is basically a way to prevent people from knowing that you're even using a VPN service, which is also a cause for consideration in countries where censorship is huge, like China, for example. If you're using a VPN, or as we've heard in Kashmir, people have been stopped and they've been asked to show their phones and to see if the VPN software is on there. And so if you're in an area like that and you don't want to kind of show that you're on a VPN, your VPN service then needs to support some kind of a masking mechanism. And so in Tor networks, and we haven't talked about Tor at all because there have been no questions about that so far, but I'll just cover that as a last bit. So essentially, Tor is an alternative to VPNs, and what it does, TOR, the onion router is what it used to be called, and what it allows you to do is it functions very similar to a VPN, but it's a VPN that's open to the public, and it's run by volunteers. It's a funded project. It's a US funded project for the large part. And so it's basically a bunch of volunteers who volunteer to bounce your traffic around their computers so that it becomes hard for people who are trying to track you to see what you're doing. So Tor is sort of a public VPN effort, but there are qualifications and caveats to that, so we can come into that in a bit. But coming back to proxying and VPNs. So if your VPN service provider is logging, is keeping a track of what you're doing while you're on their network, then it's not really secure anymore. It's not that safe. And so that becomes a question for you to ask when you're looking at a VPN service provider. Always go to their site, read the about page, see if it's a registered company. If it's a registered company, look at what country they're registered in. So for in Western countries, for example, there's the concept of the 14 eyes and the 5 eyes and the 9 eyes. These are essentially countries who have agreed to collaborate on signal intelligence or online intelligence. So if the country happens to be in one of the 14-eye countries or the 5-eye countries or the 9-eye countries, you know that the restrictions on them are going to be higher. The focus is going to be on preventing extremism. It's going to be on Western democracy, things like that. If your VPN, on the other hand, is based in an Asian country, it's probably being run by somebody who's on the Chinese side or maybe a Russian actor. It basically tells you what to expect on the VPN. And different VPNs will provide you different kinds of services. I mean, for pure privacy, I've been using AirVPN primarily because they allow me to pay for it in cryptocurrency, which means I can buy it completely anonymously. And so there's almost like zero trace of who owns it. There's no linkage back to me. But if your requirement is simply to proxy yourself out to the US to see a show that's been banned in Netflix in India, then even one of the free VPNs might work because all you're doing is going across and watching a show. It's not something which you might get into trouble for per se. But if you're engaged in activism, if you're a whistleblower, if you're engaged in journalism, which is potentially going to bring back repercussions onto you, then you might want to use a little bit. You might want to be a little bit more choosy about whose VPN service you use. In times like we have right now, where a lot of people are working from home and they actually just want to securely communicate with their families and friends, you can actually set up your own VPNs. Generally, every community has a couple of techie friends in there who can set up a VPN for them. If not, please get in touch with us. We can help you set up these kind of small private VPN networks if that's something you'd like to experiment with. And there's a little bit of technology experience involved, but it's not as difficult as you'd expect it to be. And from the point of view of the users who are using it, there's really not much change in their behavior required. Um, so coming back to this other question of how do you give children access without getting them into trouble? I think that's more of a sociological question than a technological one. To be very honest, the question that I would ask is, for one, the internet is like the open street. If you're sending your children out to school, you know where they're going. As they get older, you have less and less control. So the same thing applies to the internet. I mean, if you really want to protect your kids, I guess honestly the only way I can recommend is to kind of empower them to come back and talk to you more. So that when they're in trouble, they know who to turn to, and thankfully, most countries are now implementing laws which are sort of broad spectrum. To answer your question, the laws that protect children are getting to be a little more broad spectrum than being very specifically technologically dependent. I think in terms of what law can do for people online, it's already there's already work that's on that front. People are already raising we finally have a section in the IPC for online stalking, 354D. And so and it's kind of it doesn't specify medium, it doesn't specify technology. It's kind of very broad in its approach. It says if you're tracking a woman online, if you're following the behavior online, that's good enough to qualify as stalking. So then the question becomes about evidence and things like that. But of course there's still challenges with that law. It very kind of pointedly says only for women, and it kind of leaves out all the other genders. So there's all those challenges those are really sociological challenges. It's not something that technology can really help you with. I think what really helps is to have shared media. I mean, it's a practical way to be kind of more aware of what's going on with your children. Is to kind of go a little bit away from this use of very exclusive private media. Have a shared computer in the house. Start with that, and there will be embarrassing moments for everyone. Somebody will forget to delete their history, and something messy might show up. But that's really when you kind of up the ante on the conversation. And most of the people who are my age kind of grew up with shared media as the sort of policing mechanism. You learn to manage your behavior online because it's always a shared medium. And I think right now we've kind of gone to this model where everybody having their own device is sort of the norm. And I think giving people access is great. If the medium is shared, people can explore possibly together and find out more about what's available online, including some of the nastier stuff. I mean, it's been there for a number of years. And if you run across it, it's almost like you kind of confronted with the requirement to come up with a strategy to incorporate that into regular life. I think it's really time we all let our guard down a little bit and went out and explored. That's a personal opinion, of course. Everybody's kind of requirements vary, but yeah, definitely in terms of protecting kids, it's important to educate kids about cameras and where they're located, where they might be being photographed. I think those are more important things than what children do themselves online, because that's largely exploratory. And if you're generally uh, kind of stuff that people come across, the dark web exploration, what you come across for most people, it's grounds to turn back and say, hey, I don't really want to go down that path. So it's also a great way for people to understand, where their boundaries and where their limits are. And information, can be a double-edged sword. So what's really important is to have a coping mechanism for all kinds of stuff that you might come across. And I really encourage parents of children to be more active on the internet, know what's out there, explore a little bit more, because that's really the only way you know what's going on. I mean, if you've never been down a certain path, advising somebody how to drive on it is not really the wisest choice. You don't necessarily have the experience to do it, and we see that a lot with children and young people who we work with. They're generally much more aware and comfortable with what they find online than their parents would be. So what might be interesting is to have children be involved in that conversation about, have you gotten into a nasty situation online and how did you solve it? Maybe you can help us all learn and get that conversation going. The more open conversations you have, I guess, the more protected everybody is. So I mean, on children and protection, I guess that's really the extent of advice I'd give, because anything more, saying that don't allow kids onto this channel or that channel, I don't think that's really feasible anymore. It's more important to understand. Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's really important to understand why children are interested in exploring a certain area, or why it's relevant at this point in their lives. What kind of peer group they're in, and honestly, a good measure. I've kind of looked at this as a great measure of checking how people are doing with their within their families, is how connected are you on social media. I mean, it's a great place to start, and if we've gone to the place where people have started having separate accounts for separate groups, that's impressive discretion in practice. And so, if you reach that level of evolution and maturity in your communication, um, it's that's a sign that society is evolving. We live our lives substantially as online citizens, and just as we would do certain things in certain public spaces and not do certain things in certain public spaces. I think it's a great it's a great analogy for managing your behavior online as well. So yeah, and definitely, if anybody has young people who'd like to get their queries answered, feel free to reach out. More than happy to help. I've had people come and tell me that, hey, my 6-year-old is now able to get into more things than I can, and I'm having a nightmare about it. I guess my advice to that kind of a scenario is, that's a child with a lot of energy and a lot of passion. You put them into something that channels it better, and you'll find a lot better results. But coming back to the point at hand, in terms of basic privacy protection mechanisms, I think using a VPN is now something that all of us should consider getting good at. Simply because we also use a lot of public network infrastructure. So, say you're at the airport and you're using the Wi-Fi of the airport. You should know that anybody who's on that same Wi-Fi can potentially look at all the traffic that's coming out of your computer as well. It may be encrypted traffic, which is encrypted between you and a website, but they can still see it, and that can reveal a lot about your personal stuff. So I'm going to actually switch to a quick demo of what a VPN looks like in practice. Give me 1 second here. All right, everybody can see the Android screen. I've got a phone screen shared out. I don't know how visible it is. Right. So simple example. I'm just going to open up a Chrome browser, regular one. So there you go. It's telling me right here, Google uses your location to give you local content. So that's one piece of information that's going right out to Google. My location is being broadcast all the time. If I'm on an open Wi-Fi connection, it's still encrypted, but it's still stuff going on a wire that people can look at. I'm going to close this out. So simple Google search, what's my IP, and let's see what comes up. Not sharing anything. Okay, so for some reason, I guess the emulator doesn't like the screen share. So I'm going to stop this and just open up a regular browser. So trust demos to fail in ways that you can never predict in a pre-test. So meanwhile, let's keep the questions coming. If somebody has more questions, I got one that says, "Can I create my own VPN at home somehow linked to my Wi-Fi?" To answer that question, you can create a VPN that involves machines in your home and say your phone, for example. And you could, basically you'd be putting both machines on a VPN together, and then they basically be able to communicate with each other. Am I talking on mute? No. Okay, great. So I've got my Windows machine booting up, so I can show the VPN thing on that instead. But yeah, I mean, to answer the question, yes, if you have a machine at home that you'd like to access securely from your phone or from other places, or you have a home computer and your laptop, you can basically attach them both to the same VPN, and then they can communicate the same way they would over your local Wi-Fi. But again, that depending on how secure you want it to be, different configurations would apply. So it's a slightly more specific question. Depending on what you're looking for, I could possibly share a few ways to do that. All right, so we'll try this on Windows instead. That's a random ID that I have that I use for demos. I'm not breaking into anybody's computer in case that's a concern. What's the point of knowing my IP address? Okay, so your IP address essentially tells people where you're located. So I'll just show you in a second. I'm going to open up Firefox. Right. Right. So you see, this is the public IP address that I'm currently displaying to everyone. I'm going to copy this, and if I actually go and do what's called a whois lookup, you can actually find out a fair about me. So here you go. So if I go and look at that IP address, it tells me that it belongs to a company called Rural Broadband Private Limited India, which with a little bit more of effort, you can quickly go and find out that that's the company that operates the brand Air Jaldi, which is my ISP provider at the moment in where I live in Nainital. So that essentially means that, if I was using this IP address to engage in any kind of illegal activity, and this IP address showed up, the police could then take this IP address, go to Rural Broadband Private Limited, and say, um, who use this. So to answer the question, could somebody else find out my IP address? It depends on what service you're using. So if I open a website, the website knows who asked for that IP address. So if it's a website, say the railway website, if I go and make a request, they know that so and so IP address is the one making the request. So they have a log of it. Which means, if you went on Facebook and potentially threatened to kill someone, Facebook could use the IP address from where that post generated and track you down and prevent you from, committing that murder. But it could also mean that if you say that you're going to organize a massive protest in so and so location, the police could prevail on Facebook if they had that agreement to find your IP address and then prevent you from holding that protest, essentially curbing dissent. So, kind of double-edged sword there. Your IP address tells people where you're located. So if you're okay with, if you're okay with it, which is fine. So interesting. If you search for your own IP address and it says it's located in a country where you're not, what it means is that your internet service provider is routing your traffic already through a place which is not kind of easily visible. So, for example, if I go and use my mobile phone to do the same search, the IP address I get might show Agra or might show Delhi, which means that that's the last point from where the web request came from. What this means is basically that the internet is essentially a network of computers. Any request you make is basically bounced around through a bunch of computers that may be public or private, depending on who owns them. And that's how it gets to the internet. So when you say, I want page so-and-so, google.com, you're basically being routed. I can actually do a quick visual demo of that. Let's try and do that. Trace path is not there anymore in Windows. Too bad. So this is let me just quickly do this on Linux instead. Yeah, please go right ahead. More questions, the better. Right. So you're in a Wi-Fi located in one country, and your phone is also linked to it. Okay. Yeah, so why would your ISP route your traffic automatically? Reasons of economy, particularly in high density countries and continents like Europe, the agreements on phone traffic vary substantially. So, for example, I started my career in Orange Telecom as a service provider from an Indian company. And at that point in time, so Orange had these agreements with a bunch of other providers like O2, so on and so forth, to route traffic, to route calls. Because if you understand, then to understand this, you need to understand the nature of the telecom industry a little bit as well. The telecom industry is based on owned infrastructure, which is then leased out to other parties. Nobody can run the global network on their own. There's no company that can singly manage all traffic that the internet represents. And so every internet service provider, every telecom service provider has agreements in place with other providers on how to route traffic, and those agreements may vary based on your service class as well. So, for example, if you're on a prepaid plan, you might have a different route, and if you're on a postpaid plan, they might be on a different route. And then there's a point in time when Orange and FT, France Telecom, they merged, and so I'm presuming a lot of architecture got shared. So those could be reasons for things to show up differently. But generally it's a marker of something. So it could mean that your base ISP is in financial trouble, and so they're leasing out traffic, they're buying traffic from somebody else. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, if you're concerned about that, it's something to write to your provider about and say, hey, I did this, and so so hang on. So my IP address is locating to me actual home in another country when I'm currently linked to a provider in a different country. Depending on what internet provider you're using, they might have your phone on a contract, which shows you, from the last point. So the routing might be that your routing will always go from your home country. It possibly not that your phone is confused. It might be a result of the GDPR or the Brexit laws that are coming in. That they might have had a requirement for you to be routed through your home country for some reason. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons that it will show up differently. But it's definitely something to ask the provider about, just for a little bit of fun. Hey, I noticed this. And I'd love to hear their answer, because sometimes the kind of answers people give back are very, very fruity. But yeah, it's definitely something to ask your provider. Hey, I'm in this country at this point in time. Why are you routing my traffic in a manner that is somewhat suspicious? Because it actually has a lot of implications. If your provider can do this in a country and route your traffic in that way, it has implications, because it means that if you switch providers even on your own phone, your traffic routing is limited by policy. So it's definitely a rights issue to take up. So this has given me a bit of chance to get my demo up. I'm just going to do a trace path to google.com. And so you see, this is how my routing is happening. I'll just zoom that in a bit. So from my computer, which is localhost, I went to openwrt.lan. So this is my local OpenWRT router, the first router. I've got a bunch of routers on my local network. So it's bounced around there. It's come out to 192.168.1.1, which is the last router on my network. And from there, it's kind of gone out to the public domain. And you can see at least a few jumps it's taken to get to where it's getting to. Generally, if you do this on an Airtel network, you'll start to see Airtel hostname show up there. So it tells you where your traffic is going through. So tracepath is a great way to look at that. That's the command in case you want to track that. Yeah, so if your ISP is routing your IP through some country, will I be able to access the content that is banned in that country? But in my country. Okay, great question. So you'll be able to access whatever is accessible to the IP address as it is shown to the provider. So for example, if your IP address shows that you are in India, you'll be able to see whatever an Indian person can see. So that's kind of one of the applications of VPNs that people have been using, is to be able to watch content that is not available in their own country. So if you just wanted to do a simple Netflix proxy, for example, you could set up a simple VPN where you have one endpoint in the US and you have one endpoint in India, and you make all your requests to the Indian server, which then tells the American server to fetch the content for you, and then it gets funneled back to you. So I think, so you'd be able to see what's available in that country. So this is what's called circumvention of censorship, essentially getting around stuff that might be banned in your country but that's legal in another country. So when I sign into Amazon US and not Amazon, am I going into the VPN? Yes and no. So from your computer to Amazon, you're on the open internet, but within Amazon, yeah, it's all the traffic that goes from Amazon internally is all on their VPN. So if you open Amazon, if you just put Amazon in the address bar and hit enter from India, it will take you to the Amazon India site. But if you do it from the US, it will take you to the US site. So based on your IP, that's how they let you access things or not. So if you want to pretend that you're in the US when you're making an order, definitely you could use a US VPN and get on there. So this is basic kind of idea of how your traffic goes out. Just coming back to VPNs and just I'm going to wind up this demo in a bit so that we can open it up to last questions. Uh, so yeah, once I have my VPN on, I'm going to start up my VPN client. In terms of what you can use for a VPN client, I generally use OpenVPN, and then that's a client that allows me to connect to any VPN service that I have an access credential for. I'll be using VPN in this example. Uh, so let's start that off. Okay, let's see. So you have an option if your VPN provider gives you a link. They'll either give you a link or they'll give you an access credential file. I'm going to use an access credential file in this case. It's already on my computer. So the file generally ends with a .ovpn extension. So depending on who you're buying your VPN from, either your VPN provider will ask you to install an extension as somebody pointed out earlier, or you can use an open source tool to connect to them. So I prefer to use OpenVPN because it's an open source platform that's available. It kind of maintains global standards across multiple services. And I like to keep that kind of transparency in the tools that I use. And so I'm going to use that to connect to an AirVPN VPN server. And if you can see that little thing going around, it's just going to start connecting with. So it generally takes a while because I think right now we've got a scenario where everybody's putting a huge amount of load on the internet. So now it's gotten connected. It says earth.vpn.airdns.org. So AirVPN gives me a choice of choosing which country I want my server to be in. I've chosen Earth, which means that it'll randomly choose the most available server across the globe because I'm broadly looking at privacy. I'm not specifically trying to pretend to be in another country. And so now if I go and do another search of what's my IP, it doesn't it doesn't tell me very easily, but I can still go up to this site and Google in Europe will not show your IP very easily because of GDPR rules. Not so. There you go. So this is my new IP address, and it says that I am based somewhere in South Holland, the Netherlands. So isn't it less secure if it's connected to a server in India? It's an interesting question. It depends. Depends on who owns the server. Based on current changes that are coming in, most Indian providers are required to include what's called lawful interception and monitoring or LIM in any platform that they're developing. So if it's a VPN that has a server in India, I would worry about it in the sense that it's just more likely to be easily accessible to law enforcement. But from a privacy point of view, an Indian server will probably proxy you as well as anybody else. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Plus, if you're using a VPN just to hide your own traffic and you wanted to just shift it off your own connection, and for that kind of stuff, it's probably okay. But if it's got anything to do with your identity, which might put you at risk or things like that, I probably wouldn't use an Indian server. My preference is generally for either a European server that is not in one of the 14 IS countries, and AirVPN, interestingly, is owned by an Italian provider who happen to be in a 14 IS country. But AirVPN has a history of being run by hacktivists and privacy enthusiasts. So I generally trust that community a little bit more. So I guess that's why I'm more comfortable using this particular provider. But again, it's a decision that everybody needs to make based on certain bit of research that you do. I hesitate to endorse one service over the other because it really depends on your particular use case. So if somebody has a particular question about, I want to do this, how would I go about it? I can take a couple of those. I don't think we have time to go into Tor. Web host, how are we doing on time? I mean, how quickly do we need to jump off? I'm good to keep going for a few more minutes. All right, cool. So we probably need to do a follow-on session for Tor. I can probably do a quick demo of Tor. So Tor is another. It's a bit of an interesting tool. It's volunteer run, and it does pretty much what a VPN does, but it bounces it across a lot of different servers. So I'm just starting up what's called the Tor browser. It's a little nicer for a visual demo. It does a little bit more on the screen. Most of our other tools are generally limited to command lines. So this is what's called the Tor browser. It's based on the Mozilla Firefox browser. Fairly simple interface, but let's go to google.com here. Since it's the most visited site in the world. And so what you'll notice is Tor is a little bit slower because it's bouncing your traffic across the world in some cases. So you might get a little bit of a speed lag. And if you can see, my text is all in Russian. So clearly Tor thinks I'm somewhere in Russia. So this is what it's done. So the Tor works on the principle of a circuit. So in this case, what it's done is it's taken my traffic, it's sent it to Germany, which is to a guard node, which is what kind of the gatekeeper of the Tor network. And then that server sent it to Finland, which sent it to Russia, which sent it to google.com. And so, from Google's point of view, I'm coming in from Russia, so it's showing me content in Russian. And so Tor is a much broader conversation to get into, but for very basic private browsing, I think Tor is a great place to start. I'd encourage people to read about it. I'll put the link in the chat, and if there are questions, we can take those up. If anybody found this useful and they'd like to do follow-on sessions, please let us know. We'd love to do more of these. I know a few of the communities who we are part of are very keen to support in this. A big thank you to Nalcon for providing the conferencing service for this. I'd be very grateful if I could get a copy of the video as well. I think we recorded parts of this. To get to English, there's generally an option on Google to change your language, but you'd have to do a little bit of journeying around to figure out what that looks like. So that's the link. Oh. There. And I'll be putting out the notes and the video once we have it somewhere where people can watch it. And thanks so much everyone for joining. Any last words, any questions, please do let me know. Follow session will be great. Cool, we'll put out word on one of our public channels, either the Hackergram page or I'll be talking to Zanab, who's here from HasGeek. Maybe we can do something with that community. Be great to do a larger audience for this. Great, everyone. Thanks so much. Signing off.